Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming back after your exam in biochemistry, for the majority of you. So we're going through the endocrine organs, and I thought there's a reasonable place to start would be close to where we left off, which is with the adrenal gland, which is in the vicinity of renal or kidney, and that's indicated here. And if we look into this a little bit, we have two subparts, the medulla in the middle and the cortex at the periphery. You don't need to memorize the sublayers within the cortex, but you know the hormones produced in each. The major ones are the adrenal medulla is epinephrine for your short-term stress response, mobilizing energy stores. And the adrenal cortex is producing the steroid hormone cortisol for your longer-term stress response. This is in the category of glucocorticoids, oids, steroids, and also you have sex steroid, which is a minor contributor in the males, and because they have another source, and more for the females. Lastly, aldosterone, mineralocorticoid, involved in the removal of potassium and the retention of sodium at the kidney, at the urinary system. Okay, so these ones in the medulla, amines, primarily epinephrine, also norepinephrine, under neural control. So these ones are not controlled by the tropic hormone system. Now we come to the pancreas, which has a couple of functions. One is through exocrine cells, the production of enzymes. Our concern here with hormones is in these little clusters of cells called islets of Langerhans, and they produce four hormones, all of which are proteins or peptides. And the first two are the most famous two, which are glucagon and insulin. And their fundamental role pertains to the fact that we do not eat all the time in a steady, continuous infusion of calories, but in fact we eat in designated times, but yet we need to keep a constant supply of glucose in the bloodstream to supply the brain, which is heavily dependent on glucose. And so, in the case where the blood glucose level is above its set point, production of insulin leads to the uptake of glucose into cells for storage and prevents that from staying too high. So it undoes the effect of the error signal, just to repeat some terms, and returns the blood glucose to its set point. The glucagon has the opposite effect. It leads to the enhancement of blood glucose level when it has fallen below its set point. The other two are also peptides. We have somatostatin, involved in regulation of digestive enzyme production, and also in the level of glucagon being maintained. And we have lastly this pancreatic polypeptide, which has a role in inhibiting excessive food intake. Sorry about the irritation from the lights. I don't have an immediate solution to that.
Can you repeat the somatostatin?
The somatostatin is involved in regulation of the level of glucagon and digestive enzyme production. Questions to this point? Okay, well, I just said those things. And now there's this table which gives you a little summary of the majority of what's been said so far today and in the last lecture. They do condense quite a little bit in terms of the hypothalamus, so you would need to have that other summary slide with the overall layout of what tropic hormones lead to the production of what other tropic hormones at the anterior pituitary in order to have a full description of what's going on. So, having said that, let's do just a random point of review here. If you consider the hormones produced by the hypothalamus, with the exception of one, all of them are in what chemical category? Chemical category, but yes, there were the neurohormones, so functionally that's there. Peptides. And the exception is prolactin inhibiting hormone, and that is an amide. So yesterday I asked somebody, can you name 10 hormones that are peptides? And the person hesitated for quite a while, but if you needed to do that, you could catch 6 through reference to the hypothalamus and its tropic hormones released to the anterior pituitary. Could pick up another 6 from the anterior pituitary itself, a couple from the posterior pituitary, another 4 we've just seen from the pancreas, and then there's one from the parathyroid, one from the thymus, one from the pineal gland, melatonin. So lots of peptide messengers. In terms of memory work, recall we're leaving out from progestins on down. We'll just take ovaries and estrogens as the endpoint here. And in terms of secondary endocrine organs, those whose endocrine function is not the first most famous role which they play, that we just are going for memory of a couple of examples, which are the liver and the heart. Those are our 2 examples to remember. Questions to this point? Yes?
Which ones do we not have to remember again?
Any of that, and any of this except that word and that word. And for this, remember it all down to this dividing line that's just above progesterone. Other questions? Right, so the control of hormone levels in the blood is a whole mass of words there, and it's really pretty much self-evident. It is controlled, the amount of hormone of a given kind in the blood depends on how quickly it is produced and released into the blood, how much is being produced by secretory cells. That is influenced by signals both from the nervous system and from the blood itself, in other words, the levels of the other hormones. So those are the two main factors. The nervous system and the other hormones cause influence on the amounts of hormone released. Then you have the amount of metabolism or degradation. Some of them are removed in the liver. Some of them are degraded in the blood. Some of them are degraded at the target cell. In terms of their half-lives, how long it takes for half of a given amount to be metabolized, this is also influenced by the fact that the hydrophobic ones, which means lipophilic, which means steroids and thyroid hormone, those ones with their binding to carriers being required to get them to their destinations, those carriers have a stabilizing effect which causes them to have a long half-life relative to the peptides and the other amines. Here you have an example of where, for memory purposes, you can begin condensing, because this entire picture is just an example of one of the parts on that summary slide that has all the different tropic hormones from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, leading in this case to the adrenal cortex. The only thing that's different is that neural signals can trigger this release. And since we've already said cortisol is produced in response to long-term stress, this would be things like burn injuries or frostbite, where there's damage in the area that's sustained. The stressor serves as the signal to the nervous system that leads to this hormone being produced by way of this hypothalamic pituitary adrenal cortex sequence or axis. So, having said the signal is neural, there's nothing new separate to memorize on this slide. If you want to use this one instead of one of the others, that is fine. The point is not to memorize 50 things if there are only 30 things, treating 20 of them as different, just because they show on different pictures here. Here again, we have the fundamental concept of a regulated variable. If there is an increase in blood glucose, as I had mentioned, insulin secretion is signaled by that to go up. The glucose is taken up, and the blood glucose level goes back down to the set point. Same concept with blood potassium and aldosterone. Here's an example of hormones, of blood-borne signals regulating the amount of hormone secretion. So these particular ones are metabolites or ions, regulated variables. Those can serve as the signal for a change in the amount of production of one of these hormones. Now, and then of course, the long and short loops of negative feedback will have regulatory effects also. and then there's the direct effect of one tropic hormone causing another to be produced. So those are the ways in which hormones, as opposed to metabolites, regulate the amount of some other hormone in the blood. Is that straightforward for you? Okay, so now we come to the instance where the production of a hormone is abnormal in terms of amount, and there are two fundamental categories of abnormality. One is too little, hyposecretion, and one is too much, hypersecretion. Acromegaly is overgrowth of the distal extremities, like overgrown hands and feet, in the case of a person who has excessive growth hormone. Then diabetes type 1, the example there is insufficiency of insulin production. So you have then a deficiency in glucose uptake, which interferes with the supply of energy to the cells. The third instance is that the hormone level is appropriate, but the tissue that's the target cell, has an excessive or muted response. Now here we have another distinction. The abnormality in the case of a hyper or a hyposecretion can come in the case of the tropic hormone system from multiple locations. So, if you go to the doctor and you show signs of hyperthyroidism, aspiring and working out vigorously, lots of energy being metabolized, they will test not just for the level of thyroid hormone, but for the level of the thyrotropin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, or the thyroid-stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. And in measuring those three different levels, they can find where is the likely source of the problem. So, if you have, okay, let's see, I guess we're stuck with cortisol. So I'll just say thyroid hormone anyway. The concept is exactly the same. Concept is that this hormone, when it's produced, causes this one to be released. This one inhibits that one and promotes this one. This one inhibits both of these two. When you make reference to a hyposecretion, you are talking about the amount from the organ that is producing the direct hormone that's not a tropic hormone, the one that has a direct impact on metabolism in the case of the thyroid hormone, or stress response in terms of this one. And so if you have what's called a primary hyposecretion, that means that too little of this hormone in the third box is being produced due to a defect in that organ. For instance, some autoimmune condition has caused an attack on the cells there, and they've been killed or damaged. So hyposecretion, always in the context of these sets of three hormones, hyposecretion always means that the last one is underproduced. hypersecretion always means that the last one is overproduced. You have a rise from the baseline appropriate amount of production of this hormone. Now, to distinguish the words primary and secondary, in the case of a primary hypo or hypersecretion, the problem initiates in the organ that produces that third hormone. So, if you have an excess of thyroid hormone being produced, or cortisol, depending when you prefer to read or listen, if you have an excess of this one being produced, each molecule of it has a regular amount of negative feedback. And now there are more such molecules. They are going to lead, if there are too many of them, to an excessive negative feedback, which is going to cause both of these tropic hormones to be underproduced. That in turn will weaken these signals, leading to the production of the hormone here. But given that there is an overproliferation of secretory cells, if we take hypersecretion, then that is not sufficient, that weakened signal is not sufficient to fully correct the hypersecretion by the third organ. Now, so your distinction then becomes, if you have too much thyroid hormone and you have very low levels of TRH and TSH, that tells you that you don't need to be looking immediately for a tumor in one of these two organs, causing it to have too many endocrine cells and produce too strong a signal. It tells you that your problem is in the thyroid gland, or in this case, adrenal cortex itself. If you have instead a circumstance where CRH or TRH is underproduced, but TSH or ACTH is overproduced, and then thyroid hormone or cortisol is overproduced, this tells you that the problem is most likely originating in the pituitary gland. And an overgrowth of cells, possibly precancerous, is one possible explanation why this could occur. This one is called a secondary hypersecretion, because the overproduction of this hormone that causes the symptom is secondary consequence of a malfunction in one of the organs that produces the tropic hormone. So you have too much produced here, that causes too much to be produced here. This negative feedback will have some effect, but not enough to nullify the initial problem here. There will be lots of both of these. Both then will inhibit the production of the first one. And so your CRH or TRH will be greatly diminished. if all three of them are overproduced, that is suggestive of a hypersecretion, also called secondary, which originates with a problem in the hypothalamus. And the converse will be true for all of the cases pertaining to hyposecretion. And if I give you some example related to one of the other sets of tropic hormones, for instance, the ones related to body growth or the ones related to sexual action, then it would be analogous in concept to this one. So questions on this concept? Okay, how many are ready to move forward? How many would like me to repeat something? No? Okay. Hormone interactions are the last subject. I've mentioned antagonism as the major example, where one hormone will raise the value of some regulated variable and another will lower it. Consequence is that you can keep a regulated variable at its set point under ideal conditions. And the examples that come first to mind are glucagon and insulin at the pancreas, related to blood glucose. Calcitonin and parathyroid hormone, related to blood calcium. And then your two pairs of releasing and inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus, acting on the anterior pituitary. So obviously growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone are antagonists. Likewise for prolactin releasing and inhibiting hormones. Additiveness is a concept for which I found relatively few examples when I looked through the literature, and in fact they weren't even examples in humans. Additiveness would be a case where if you had, let's say, 5 units of glucose production into the blood due to glucagon, and another 5 units due to a given amount of growth hormone, that then if you had both of those at the same time, you'd get a total of 10 units of glucose. The normal situation is synergism. Synergism would be, in that case, where one little blip of glucagon was going to cause 5 units of glucose. A little blip of growth hormone was going to cause 5 units to be produced. And if you have both of those units at the same time, you actually get 15 or 20 or 50 units of glucose. So there's an acceleration of the response, what you might call a super additive response, when 2 hormones are present that each on its own would have the same function. So the example that I give for synergism, which would be perhaps maximum case, because we can draw in 4 different hormones that all lead to enhancement of blood glucose supply. So one is that you have a hungry teenager. So he's hungry. That's going to lead to glucagon production because there isn't high glucose level. He's also growing, so we'll make it a late evening situation. And he has twisted his knee playing sports, and so he has an ongoing physical stressor with which to contend, which has elevated the cortisol. And then poor soul, his sibling pulls a fire alarm and causes a shot of adrenaline as well. So the effect of those would be synergistic. If each of those things on its own would cause 5 units of glucose production or release into the blood, then having 2 of them might make 15 units, having 3 of them might make 70 units, and having all 4 of them you might get 300 units. And those are arbitrary numbers to illustrate the concept of synergism. It wouldn't just be 5 plus 5 plus 5 plus 5 for 20. You'd have an accelerating enhancement in the amount of fuel being released. Okay, and the last concept is permissiveness. This refers to one hormone being required for another to exert its function. This example might not yet make sense to you, seeing as we haven't taught respiratory system. And this phrase for receptors will come along a few chapters down from here. But what it means is that to have a catecholamine exert its effect, you have to have a receptor for that on the target cell. And in this instance, you need one of the hormones, which is thyroid hormone in this case, to be produced. Its role when it gets to the target cell, so now amine that's the exception, the one that's lipophilic, so it's one of these ones that goes into the target cell, binds to its receptor. The receptor ligand complex, 2 pairs bind to DNA. That triggers expression of a gene. The gene being expressed is the one that encodes for a receptor protein, which ends up being inserted in the plasma membranes of these target cells. If this hormone were not present, these receptors would not be produced, and so then if you had a shot of adrenaline or epinephrine from the fire alarm, then you would not have a response. So it means thyroid hormone must have its action to permit the catecholamine from having its effect in this example. So those concepts require reiteration. How many have questions? Yes.
How is permissiveness different from tropic hormones?
Well, I guess in a sense you could say that a tropic hormone has to be there for the next one to be I don't know if it's that it has to be present for any to be produced. It's a signal for an enhancement of the production.
So,
But yeah, there's some similarity to those ideas.
so if missing this, it won't happen at all without the initial hormone acting on it.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Now, I always hesitate using the words all and none and always and never. But within the context of this explanation, without considering other hormones or other causes of gene expression, then yes, that's the concept. Other questions about classes of chemical messengers, about ways that they act at the target cell, and about the categories of hormones. Let's do a verbal pop quiz. What are the 5 chemical categories of chemical messengers? Peptides, amines, amino acids, steroids, eicosanoids. Each one of you write the word eicosanoid on a blank piece of paper just to see how close you can get to the right spelling. No, it's not an actual quiz, it's just a self-test. Now, out of those 5, which ones can be, or which ones have examples that are hormones, and which do not? Steroids, so there are hormones that are steroids. Peptides, there are hormones that are peptides, such as CRH and TRH. Amines, such as catecholamines, or thyroid hormone. Catecholamines being dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Are there any amino acids that are hormones? Nope. Are there any eicosanoids that are hormones? Nope. So you can do that cross-connecting between your functional and chemical categories. I put the lights up not just because the dim ones are aggravating, which I apologize, even though it's not my fault, but because in terms of number of chapters, this marks the midpoint of the course. So 6 down and 6 to go, and we're still in September, but we're not really ahead because chapter 10 is a lot bigger than chapter 1. So, but it's worth taking a little pause and noting that we now, in a conceptual sense, come to the second half of the course, because we are going to be talking, okay, now I guess I have to put the lights down again. We are going to be talking about the nervous system for most of the rest of the course. And we are going to come, first off, to subdivision of the nervous system into central and peripheral nervous systems. The first time I taught this course, I thought, oh, I've been so horrible on the second and third midterm exams. I'm going to give them a throwaway, easy question on the first half of the final exam. And that was to say the nervous system is subdivided into the blank and the blank. The idea is that if you put the words that filled those 2 blanks, you would have the entire nervous system. And the answer to that then would be the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which delivers information to the central nervous system. Turn this into the proper slideshow. And the system which takes signals away from the central nervous system to the rest of the body. So the peripheral subdivides into afferent and efferent subdivisions. Afferent, some people say afferent to emphasize the letter A, as opposed to efferent to emphasize the letter E. I'll try and do it without being that blunt, but you can hear the distinctions. So the peripheral nervous system subdivides as signal delivery to the CNS, which is afferent, before efferent in the alphabet, and then efferent is signals coming back out from the CNS to the body. So the next part of the question was, what are the two subdivisions of this? There they are. What are the two subdivisions of this? There they are. This has always been about 10 points worth somewhere on one of the midterms or the final exam. And so it occurs to me to hammer on the point as our broadest overall framework of discussion of the nervous system. A couple of years ago, I had a very clever student where they had an A on the course, came back and had an argument with me about this question from the final exam as to the nervous system being subdivided into this, and each of the parts being subdivided, CNS as brain and spinal cord, PNS as afferent and efferent divisions. And so the person, I think, had central and peripheral and had some narrower subdivision within the CNS and was determined that that was correct. And so I very unkindly said, I did preface it by, this isn't as rude as it's about to sound, but where is your brain? And actually I didn't preface it because her companion got the joke a few moments earlier than she did. So, do I make my point? This isn't one of the slides to cross out. Now here's a picture of it, and this is, again, kind of a schematic conceptual diagram, and it allows for a little summary of the next 5 chapters, because the first consideration, chapter 7, is going to be how an individual neuron within any of these systems works. What happens at a molecular and organellar level within the individual neuron. So that would fit within any of the little boxes here. Chapter 8 concerns the action between 2 neurons. How does one neuron send a signal to a second neuron in a sequence? Chapter 9 is the central nervous system. What are some of the foundational structures? Also, what are the most fundamental divisions, subdivisions, sub-subdivisions, and what are the parts, what are the things that they do? One of the sub-subdivisions in here is the hypothalamus, which produces trophic hormones. So you'll tether chapter 9 back to chapter 6. Chapter 10 is the afferent nervous system, the various signals that come from the external or internal environments and impinge in some way on a neuron which delivers a signal to the central nervous system. And that might be a pinprick, or it might be stretching of the digestive tract, or it might be a photon coming from somebody's most radiant shirt. And chapter 11 then is going to be the signals coming out, somatic and autonomic, and then this will further have subdivisions in terms of what effector organs receive those neural signals. Chapter 12, finally, is a straight spillover from Chapter 11 into the musculoskeletal system, and specifically, primarily the skeletal muscles. And so the working of those, regulated by this subdivision of this division of the peripheral nervous system, will be the wind up at the end of the course. And then you'll get this lot in BMD 335 next semester. This slide right here is the only one named twice on the study guide for the course. That should be a further hint that this is a good overall framework for your understanding. You have to have the trunk of the tree in order to hold and position the branches, and in turn the twigs, and in terms the leaves and the leaf veins and their individual cells. So this is your framework for understanding the nervous system. Now, this chapter concerns what happens in the individual cells, and it's therefore useful to start off with a generic diagram of a mainstream neuron. Now, if we get way back to about the third or fourth slide in chapter 1, there were different neurons shown with very different levels of elaborate structure. There, the emphasis was on diversity within a given range, but in terms of a broader stand back, looking at similarity, there are general structural parts to a neuron which are typical to most. And those parts, most fundamentally, are the dendrites, which receive signals the cell body, or soma, which integrates them and performs the other cellular functions that are needed. And then the axon, which delivers signals from the cell body to the end of the neuron, where a messenger is released. If we go back to our 5 chemical categories of messengers, steroids are all hormones, and the eicosanoids are all paracrine and autocrine. Those are the 2 lipophilic ones. So the other 3 are lipophobic. So you have amino acids, have amines, and you have peptides. We'll see later that there are some other ones too. But in general, these are lipophobic molecules that will be released from the ending or terminal of the axon, And that means that they can be stored there in advance of their need and release. So the general idea is that an electrical signal will happen in the dendrites and or the cell body. If it's of sufficient magnitude and duration, it will instigate an electrical signal at the axon hillock, which is the beginning part of the axon coming out of the cell body. That electrical signal will propagate along the plasma membrane of the axon, when it reaches the ending or axon terminal, then it will trigger exocytosis of neurotransmitter molecules which have been stored there in secretory vesicles. You may have heard, actually pause, is anybody needing me to pause for a moment? Okay, so you may have heard, and this is frequently the case, usually the case, that there are multiple dendrites feeding in signals to a cell body, and that there is then one axon that extends from the cell and delivers signals to its target. So many dendrites, one axon. One little permutation to note in this diagram is what's called a collateral axon, or axon collateral. Use those two interchangeably. So there's one axon terminal, one axon hillock extending from the body of the cell. It can have branches that deliver signals to two different sets of axon terminals. And that will allow this neuron to signal to one here and another one here. So those are your foundational concepts. Dendrite, soma, or cell body. Take those two as substitutable terms. Soma versus cell body. Axon, which has at its beginning point the axon hillock and its ending point the axon terminals. And here we go back to the idea of there being substantial variation in terms of the numbers of projections and their branching and sub-branching. We come here to the fact that a neuron most often has multiple dendrites, one axon, which is a longer projection, typically, to target cells. But this is actually just one structural subclass of neurons. It's the most common one, but it's just one subclass, and it's called multipolar. So multipolar neuron has multiple dendrites and one axon. In the afferent nervous system, you have two other categories which are common. One is the bipolar cell, or bipolar neuron, which has one dendrite, and it may have branches, but there's one ultimate dendrite, delivering a signal to the cell body, and from there to one axon at the other side. This occurs in the visual and olfactory systems, although you don't need to memorize that yet. The other category, which is most common in the other afferent systems, is called a pseudo-unipolar neuron. Unipolar would imply only one projection out of the cell body. In fact, what you have is very similar to a bipolar neuron, except that the signal that instigates in the dendrite can propagate essentially continuously to the axon, with the cell body being attached but somewhat off to the side. In this case, the dendrite, in terms of the nature of the electrical signals, functions very much like an axon, and therefore is called a peripheral axon, because it is furthest from the central nervous system. And this one that leads from the cell body to the central nervous system is called the central axon. So that's why these terms appear here. So note these three categories of structural classes of neurons. Your extra tidbit for the day that is not anywhere other than in my mind and lecture. Well, it's in neurobiology books, but you wouldn't be typically reading those of this. And that is what's called an anaxonic neuron. So A-N, A-X, O-N, I-C. Who would like to hazard a guess at what an anaxonic neuron looks like?
Does it have an axon?
Yes, it looks like it doesn't have an axon. In terms of what's actually going on, that's another matter, and not everything is known about all of these things. So the general idea is that neurons receive and deliver signals. This one, in its structure, looks a little bit different. It's probably the case that one of the projections has an axonic function, but just is not prominent that way. But the point is to say, as with the chemical classes of messengers, that this categorization covers most, but not all, of the cells in question. So the point is that Mother Nature comes first. Whatever she's got in there, we have to learn about it. We can create categories to condense a large fraction of the stuff, but if some of the things don't fit, then we have to deal with that. So we can't box all the neurons into these three functional structural categories. The other subdivision, by analogy to the messenger molecules, is that there is a functional subcategorization. Here I can't think of an exception, but the functional is the interneurons, which are cells that are between one neuron and another. So they receive a signal from one neuron, they deliver a signal to another neuron. In terms of proportions, the overwhelming majority of cells of neurons in the body are interneurons. But there are two other categories, names of which should be suggestive of their functions. The afferent ones receive signals from something other than a neuron and deliver a signal to a neuron. The efferent ones receive a signal from a neuron and deliver a message to something other than a neuron, which is called an effector organ. So in terms of the structures of these, notice that the interneurons are primarily multipolar. The efferent ones are most commonly multipolar. And the afferent ones are most commonly pseudo-unipolar.